Okay,
Oi.
so before I put up anything on the side, I want to share an idea which I had, which I think is a very amazing and beautiful idea. Um, and then hopefully we'll begin chapter 4. It ties into everything on every level, as you're going to see in a minute. The recently studying in Daf Yomi, we hit a very famous story, and the story was the story of Nachum Ish Gamzu. Nachum, the person who walked around the world saying Gamzu Latova, this also is for good. Now, there's some fascinating things about that, in the sense that he wasn't called Rabbi Nachum Ish Gamzu; he was called Gamzu Latova. So we have to, at the end, we'll try to figure out why he was called. I think he was a rabbi, so why don't they call him Rabbi Nachum Ish Gamzu? Like, you don't call a rabbi by his first name. So instead, we called him Nachum Ish Gamzu, Nachum the Gamzu man, because he was, he would say Gamzu Latova. This too is for the best. Why wasn't he given the name of Gamzu? We know that they're given the name of Rabbi. We also know that he had a student by the name of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was his student for 22 years. And you also have to wonder why Rabbi Akiva, which we're going to talk about what he taught in a minute, but Rabbi Akiva, why Rabbi Akiva wasn't also called, because he also had that same attitude of his Rebbe, why wasn't he called Rabbi Akiva Gamzu? So it's Gamzu tzarich liot Gamzu, right? In other words, he also should have been called Gamzu. If his Rebbe was called Gamzu because Gamzu Latova, Rabbi Akiva had the same attitude, so why wasn't he called that also? Okay, so fascinatingly, the Gemara tells us that you would imagine, if the Gemara says that he was called Gamzu Latova because everything in his life he said this also is for good, you would imagine that the Gemara is going to bring us many, many stories where we see this attitude developed and come about. And the truth is, the Gemara brings only one story. And what's the story? The story is that the Romans had forced the Jews. They gave them an ultimatum. They were going to kill a certain community, and unless they gave them a tribute. So they had to collect a tribute, and they collected all the money. And then it was a huge amount, a whole chest full of gold and silver and valuables, and they had to bring it to Rome. So they had to find somebody who was appropriate to bring it. So they took the biggest tzaddik in the town. They took the biggest righteous person. And it was Nachum, this man Nachum Ish Gamzu. So they sent him on his way. He went to a hotel. He was sitting around that night in the inn, and he was talking about the fact that he was bringing a tribute up to Rome. The people that were there weren't the best upstanding citizens. And when he went to sleep, they opened up his chest. They saw what he had in there. They stole it, and they filled the chest up with dirt, knowing that when he lifted up the chest, it was still going to be heavy. He wouldn't recognize it was anything different. So that's the way it happened. He wakes up in the morning. He puts everything into the chest, and he picks up the chest. He loads it, and he goes up to Rome. When he gets to Rome, he goes to the king, and he says, "We brought you, the Jews brought you a tribute." So they open up the box, and inside of the box is dirt. And the king thinks that he's playing with him. So he says, "I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill all the Jews." Eliyahu Novi, says the Gemara, Elijah the prophet, dresses up as one of the officers of the king and says to the king, "Wait, maybe that's not regular dirt. Maybe that's the dirt, that legendary dirt of Abraham. That we know that when Avram Avinu, we know this in our tradition, that when Avram Avinu went to war, in the war of the 5 kings against the 4 kings, in really World War I, when Avram Avinu went to war, so the weapon that he used was dirt. And that he would throw the dirt, and miraculously the dirt would turn to arrows. So Eliyahu Novi says, maybe it's that dirt. So the king says, okay, we'll test it. And he goes and he wages war against one of his enemies. And he takes the dirt, he throws the dirt, and it turns into arrows. And the king is dumbfounded. The king and he's amazed that this is what the Jews sent them as a tribute. This was more valuable than gold and silver and all the finery. The king rewarded Nachum Ish Gamzu handsomely, and he sent him on his way. Nachum Ish Gamzu goes back to the same hotel. That was his mistake. Goes back to the same hotel. And as he's sitting in a hotel, first of all, they were incredulous that he was still alive. Like, how did you make it through that? Because we put dirt in there. But they didn't say anything to him. Okay, fine. He's telling you all the story, and he's saying, you're not going to believe it. I opened up a thing, and miraculously, there was dirt inside. Gamzu l'tova. And he's saying the whole time, he's saying, Gamzu l'tova, Gamzu l'tova. This is also good. And then he tells them that what happened to the dirt. Well, they're thinking like this and saying, wait a second. We know where he got that dirt from. He got that dirt from right here. So we'll go bring that dirt to the king and we'll get handsomely rewarded. So they take boxes and boxes and boxes of dirt and they bring it up to the king and they say, we've brought you Abraham's dirt. Make a long story short, the king tries out the dirt and it is, in fact, nothing more than dirt. And he throws it and nothing happens. So he kills those untoward fellows, those terrible guys. He kills them and, everybody lives happily ever after. That's the story of Nachum Ish Gamzu. Now, the end of Nachum Ish Gamzu is that he ends up losing his hands and his feet. One time, a poor person comes to him and says to him, Rabbi, can you help me? He was unloading his donkey at the time. And he turned to the man and he said to him, let me unload my donkey, which is a biblical obligation, and then I will give you tzedakah. I'll take care of you. In the meantime, the guy was so starved while he was unloading his donkey, so the man died. Nachum Ish Gamzu was so moved by this that he felt that he had killed this person, that he asked God to his hands that didn't rush to give tzedakah, his feet that didn't rush to take care of this person, he should lose them, and in fact lost them, and he lost their use. They cut off, or he became lame, and he wasn't able to use his hands, and he was lying in bed, and he was an impoverished person. And he was lying in bed. They put the four corners of the bed, the legs of the bed, in water, so that the bugs wouldn't be able to climb up on the bed, because he had no way to protect himself. He had no hands or feet, nothing to shoo away the bugs. His students came and saw the abject poverty he was living in. They wanted to take him out and give him a better place. So they started to take his stuff out. He said to them, "Don't take my stuff out." They started to take him out. He said, "Don't take me out and then take my stuff, because the house is going to collapse. Take my stuff out first and then take me out last." Because the house was only up because of the merits of Nachum Ish Gamzu, of the fact that this was the kind of person that he was, that he walked around the world saying Gamzu l'tova. Okay, beautiful. It's a beautiful story, a beautiful understanding. It's a beautiful hashkafa, a beautiful way to look at life. Gamzu l'tova. Okay. There is another Gemara that tells a story about Rabbi Akiva. That Rabbi Akiva's attitude was, Kol man de Ovid Rachmana. Everything that God does, Litava Ovid, God does for good. Again, if that's your life's attitude, which is similar to Gamzu l'tova, this is also for good, so then you would imagine that there would be a myriad of stories in order to be able to drive that point home. And again, there's only one story in the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva was traveling. He had with him a donkey for transportation, a chicken for lunch, and a fire in order to have a light to illuminate. Rabbi Akiva goes to a town and he says to the town, "Can you put me up?" And the people of the town say, "No." Rabbi Akiva is disturbed that there is no one that's willing to be machnas hareach, that's willing to host him. But he says, "Kol man da'avid rachman l'tava avid." Everything God does, he does for the best. Rabbi Akiva goes into the woods and he says, "I'm just going to have to camp out for the night." No glamping. He's, the real deal. He's camping. So he's there, and the wind comes, blows out his candle. A chicken comes and eats his, a cat comes and eats his chicken. And a lion comes and kills his donkey. And after every one of these, it's a tragedy. Every one of them is a tragedy. He loses transportation, loses his lunch, loses his lights. And on every one he says, Kol man da'av rachman l'tava avid. Everything God does, he does for the best. Wakes up in the morning, Rabbi Akiva goes back into the town. You imagine, make this movie in your mind, right? The tumbleweeds are going through the streets, right? You get the ominous Western, music playing in the background. And he walks in, and he sees nobody. Finally, he sees the person. He says to them, "What happened?" Says, "The marauders came in last night. They killed everybody in the town." Rabbi Akiva says to himself, "Kol man da'avid rachman l'tava avid." Because had I been in this town, I would have been killed. Had I had my chicken in the woods, then they would have heard it, and I had my light, they would have seen it, and had my donkey would have brayed, and they would have heard that, and I would have been dead. Kol manda of Rachmana, letava of it. Beautiful. So now you have to ask the $1 million question. Why am I telling stories? But is it story time? It's too early in the day for story time. It's the bedtime. Yeah, what are the stories? Because you have to ask yourself the question. Again, I'm going to reiterate that if Rabbi Akiva was the student of Nachum Ish Gamzu, and that Gamzu Letova and Kol Manda Ovid Rachmana, everything that God does for the best, if those are two of the same attitudes, then why wasn't Rabbi Akiva called the Rabbi Akiva Gamzu? Because he was just like Nachum Ish Gamzu, and Nachum Ish Gamzu was called Gamzu because that's what his attitude was. Rabbi Akiva's attitude was the same. Why wasn't he called that also? One of the commentaries, Yanaf Yosef, says the reason why he wasn't called that is because Gamzu was not because of his statement Gamzu Letova. Nachum was called Gamzu because he was from a place called Gimzu. And that's why he was called Nachum Ish Gimzu. And Rabbi Akiva, you can't call him Nachum Ish Gamzu. Rabbi Akiva was from wherever, Philadelphia. You can't call him Nachum Ish Gamzu because he wasn't from Gamzu. But the Yanaf Yosef himself gives another answer, which is, I think, an incredible insight. What he says is that on the surface, when you look at it, it seems that Gamzu Letova and Kol Manda Ovid Rachmana, everything that God does, he does for the best, are the same attitudes. He said it's two completely different things. Kol Manda Ovid Rachmana means that this stinks. This is lousy. It's bad. It's hard. It's hurting me. But I know in the end, it's going to be good. And I'm going through a difficulty now, and I'm having to deal with difficult things right now. But in the end, Kol Manda Ovid Rachmana, Letava of it, it's going to be good. The death of my donkey, that is it's a major tragedy. The death of my chicken, the putting out, the extinguishing of my light, the fact that nobody would put me up in a town, that there was no kind person there, these are tragedies. But I know that in the end, what appears to me to be a tragedy is in fact going to turn into something good. Either because, like Rabbi Akiva was saved from such things, or because I know that I'm going to learn something from this. I'm going to grow from this, become a better person. Nachum Ish Gamzu was on a much higher level. Nachum Ish Gamzu looked at it and said, Gamzu Letova. That means that this tragedy is no tragedy. It is by definition good. When he opened up his box, and there was dirt sitting in the box, he's got a Roman legion standing in front of him with swords. He is there meant to bring a present, and they are, for sure, they're going to think that he's mocking them. He looks at it and he says, that's good. What's in that box I know is good. He doesn't have to go through the step of saying this is bad, but it's going to turn good. This eventually is going to be okay. I have so much faith that I know that this is in fact good. And that as difficult as it seems, and as much of a Melach's moment as it is, as much of a difficult thing that it is that I'm going through, it's not difficult. It is a good thing. That's an incredibly high level to be on. Our rabbis tell us in this world, when you hear a tragic news, we do it only when we hear a death. But the truth is, whenever we hear of tragic news, we're meant to say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emes. According to the Talmud, we say, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, not just when we are the mourners, but that we say Baruch, we say it with Shem U'Malchus. We no longer say it with Shem U'Malchus. We don't say it with God's name, only when we're tearing Kriya. That's the only time we really say that bracha with God's name. But nevertheless, that's the attitude. Baruch Dayan Ha'emes. What is that? What does that mean? Baruch Dayan Ha'emes. Blesses God who is the truthful judge. That means that I don't understand what's going on here. I don't understand it. It hurts me. I feel sad. This is bringing me down. But I know that at the end of the day, there is a truthful judge. But says the Talmud that in the future, in Olam Haba, there is a totally different bracha that we recite. When terrible things happen to us, we recite the bracha of Hatov v'Hametiv. God is good and He does good. Because then we'll have a vision of being able to realize that everything in this world is good. It's all a bucket of goodness. There's goodness of this flavor and goodness of that flavor, but it's all goodness. In a physical world, it's very difficult for us to be able to see that and to appreciate that. For us, things hurt. We're in a physical world. We're bodies. We have a guf. We have emotions, and therefore, when things happen, we automatically feel that pain, and therefore we have to move out of that pain by saying that I know that this is going to turn out good. But in the world to come, but in the world of emes, in the world of truth, there I don't have to take that stage because I will recognize that everything is good. By the way, when do we say that bracha of Hatov v'Hametiv? There is one time that we say that bracha. We say that bracha in benching. The fourth bracha of Birchas Hamazon is the bracha of Hatov v'Hametiv. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam ho'el avinu malkeinu adirenu borenu go'alenu yotzenu kedoshenu kedosh Yaakov ro'enu ro'ei Yisrael hamelech hatov v'hametiv lakol. The king that is good and is metiv lakol does goodness for us. Shabachol yom vayom hu hetiv hu metiv hu yetiv lanu. You know, we get lost in the song. Hu hetiv hu metiv hu yetiv lanu. Right? So we don't realize, what are we saying? We're saying that God is awesome, He's great, and everything He does every day is hetiv, metiv, yetiv lanu. That bracha was instituted after the destruction of the city of Beitar. City of Beitar was destroyed some 60 years after the temple. It was the last stronghold in the rebellion against Rome. Bar Kokhba was situated there, and the city was destroyed. The Romans wouldn't allow the dead to be buried. The Jewish dead were piled up. The Talmud describes they were some 6 deep, and they formed a wall around the city. The city of Beitar was humongous. The amount of Jews that were slaughtered during that battle was incredible. The blood, says the Talmud, that flowed on that day was able to fertilize fields a certain distance around for 7 years. Whether that's literal or not literal, the point is that there was an incredible slaughter on that day. And the Jews were sitting out, the carcasses, the bodies were not able to be buried. The Romans wouldn't allow them to be buried. Finally, they were allowed to be buried, and miraculously, not one of them has decomposed. That a miracle was performed by God that none of them should decompose. The rabbis said God is a toiv v'hametiv. God is good and does good. Now, the only problem with that bracha, by the way, I'm totally off to the side here, but the only problem with that bracha is that who killed them in the first place? It's God. So God is a toiv v'hametiv. He's good. Like, what's going on here? There was carnage, and on that we're saying God is a toiv v'hametiv. That bracha is a reminder of ultimately where we need to get to a place of where even in such a terrible thing we have to recognize, for whatever reason that had to happen. But within it, God made sure that they were able to get a proper burial, and none of them decomposed. God is a toiv v'hametiv. Ultimately, it's not that there will be a good end to this, but this in itself is good. That was the machlokas, the difference of opinion between Rabbi Akiva and Nachum Ish Gamzu. Nachum Ish Gamzu was the Rabbi. He made it to the top. Gamzu letova, hatoiv v'hametiv. This is great. Rabbi Akiva wasn't able to climb that same height. Rabbi Akiva was only able to make it to Kol man da'avid Rachmana L'tava Avid, only able to make it. Notice Rabbi Akiva was able to see that everything in this world ultimately had a good end and a beneficial end. Whenever we have a machlokas, and that, by the way, is the reason why Rabbi Akiva was not called Rabbi Akiva Gamzu, because he wasn't Gamzu L'tova. He was Kol man da'avid, the Kol man da'avid Rachmana L'tava Avid. He was in a very different place than his Rebbe. A great place, but in a different place. He wasn't a copycat, so to speak, of Nachum Ish Gamzu. So now the question, of course, is, whenever you have a machlokas, so then the question that has to be asked is, how do we paskin? So if you take a look at Shulchan Aruch, at the Code of Jewish Law, in the Code of Jewish Law, it actually says that's Roi Adam Lomar, that it's worthy for a person to say, Kol man de'avid Rachmana L'tava Avid. It's actually a halacha, which is incredible. It's a halacha that's the way we're supposed to look at events and look at things that happen. Kol man de'avid Rachmana, everything that God tells us, that God does, L'tava Avid. Kol's man is spelled Chaf Lamed. It's easy for me to say it than to type it while I'm talking. Kol's man Chaf Lamed. Kol Zman Zayin Mem Nun. What did I say Zman? I'm sorry. I take that back. Kol man Mem Aleph Nun. It's an Aramaic word. Kol man, everything. Di Ovid Dalid Ayin Beis Yud Dalid. That is done by Rachmana Reish Ches Mem Nun Aleph, which is the Aramaic word for God. L'tava, or L'tav, Lamed Tes Beis Tov, Ovid Ayin Beis Yudalit. Kol man de Ovid Rachmana L'tav Ovid, or L'tava Ovid. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that what do you have to say every day? You have to say this. But wait, look at it carefully. The Shulchan Aruch says the words that Roy Lomar, you have to say it. What do you mean say it? You have to believe it. You have to believe that everything that's happening to you is happening to you because it's for the best. Because God is doing it for the best. What does it mean, Roy Lomar? Because nobody has to shake their head. Nobody has to shake their head. But do we believe every minute of every day that every single thing that happens is l'tava of it? When those really rough things happen, is that the automatic place we go to? It's Git. Yes, it's great. It's all going to be good. We say it, and eventually we believe it. But it's not that our belief always goes there. The Shulchan Aruch is talking to the students of Rabbi Akiva. See, Rabbi Akiva was there all the time. Rabbi Akiva lived in that world. Kol man da'avid Rachmana L'tava Avid. For many of us, we don't live in that world. It's not automatic for us. We would never admit this, of course, but it's not automatic for us. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch tells us, how do you get even to Rabbi Akiva's place? Roy Lomar. You have to say it, and say it again, and say it again, and eventually it'll steep in. Eventually it'll become a part of us that we can recognize and feel this Kol man da'avid Rachmana, that everything that God does, He does for the best. I just felt that it is such an important concept. And just the development of this, the contrast to Gamzu L'tova and the halacha, and the halacha for the average person is not the halacha for Rabbi Akiva. This is the halacha for me and you. That the average person, Roy Lomar, just keeps saying it. Just keep saying it. You don't have to believe it yet. But the more you say it, the more it'll seep in, and the more you believe it, the more you'll live your life that way. Of Kol man da'avid Rachmana L'tava Avid, that I know that this is good, and that maybe eventually we can get to the place where we get a little glimpse in our lifetime of Hatov HaMeitiv, of that everything is really amazing, and that what God is doing is incredible, that's where we have to ultimately be getting. all of this talk in Mishlei and in Sfarim like it, all of this talk about the beauty of Torah, where Torah is going to get us, and that's what Perek Dalet is. The next chapter, it's really all about the beauty of Torah again, and what Torah means to us. Which the first 9 chapters of Mishlei is all about Torah, all about our relationship with Torah, but our relationship with Torah and appreciating Torah, appreciating what it is. We're going to learn a pasuk in this next perek, a famous pasuk. Ki lekach tov nosati lochem, right? Because I gave you something beautiful. Ki lekach tov nosati lochem. I gave you a beautiful treasure. Al ta'azovu. Don't leave it. That's the theme of the next 10 psukim. Right? I gave you something beautiful. Don't leave it. Ultimately, though, what's the reason? What's the rationale behind recognizing the beauty of Torah and being inspired by the beauty of Torah? It's all ultimately about God. Torah is the way to get to God. Torah is God's words to us. Is God's instructions and his talking to us. And therefore, ultimately, I'm meant to get to God. Anything that I can do to enhance and understand my relationship with God and to understand who God is, ultimately, that's to my advantage. That allows me to get to the ultimate place, which is step 1, Kol Man Da'av Rachmana, God loves me, everything he does is great. And then step 2, that it's not that it hurts and I know in the end it's going to work, but it is actually great. To get from Baruch Dayan Emes to Hatov V'Hameitiv, that's the ultimate goal. So the loving of the Torah, of the not leaving of the Torah, the Shema B'ni Musar Avicha, all of that stuff is all ultimately get me to a place of feeling totally attached to God, of being able to get to the place of Baruch Dayan Emes, and then eventually to the place of Hatov V'Hameitiv. Okay. That's my thoughts. Yeah, I was very inspired by this. I really felt strongly that I've been sharing it a lot. I've been having to try to remember who I told it to, and so not to repeat it. But I've been sharing this idea a lot because I think that it's a total eye opener and really a magnificent idea. I hope everybody else feels the same way. And Emir Hashem, next week we will start. I don't want to dilute this. We'll start the chapter. Emir Hashem Perek Dalet. We'll start that next week. Okay.
Thank you. Beautiful thought.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
No matter where you go, it's always interesting at the end of the day.
Yeah. Baruch Hashem.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Everybody should have a beautiful, wonderful, amazing week. And we'll start with an amazing day and then an amazing week. And then Hashem will see everybody next Tuesday.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.